Value to create depth and realism. To begin, let's talk about what value is. In art, value is the scale on which you can measure light and darkness in an image. This can refer to color as well as black and white images. We can use value to change a shape into a form. Shape is an enclosed space that's flat and two-dimensional and has length and width, while a form is a 3D shape that has both space and depth. By combining all these ideas, we can create realism in our art. By using space, value, and depth, we can create this realism. The key here is to make sure that you don't outline your images. Outlining, no matter how good your value is, will always flatten your image. Before we start doing an image, let's practice on a simple value study. For this worksheet, we'll be using 7 different grades or degrees of graphite pencil. You'll notice on artist pencils that there is always a number at the back of the pencil. This tells us how much graphite versus clay was used to create the center of the pencil itself. The higher the number for a B tells us it's a soft lead containing less clay. This is going to give us a dark, rich tone and is going to have a very soft, pliable surface. I am using a 9B pencil for my first block, which will be my darkest dark of this value scale. Once I have the block fully shaded in, as dark as I can get it, I'm going to move on to my next grade. While there is a 7 and an 8B pencil between 9B and 6B, I'm going to skip on to the 6B. So that way we can really see the difference in a small increment as we go down each of the 8 blocks. Okay. Like a gradient, each step will be slightly lighter than the one before. The difference is that it's a noticeable step down and not a smooth, gradual blend. Each block I will be changing to a different pencil that is harder and containing more clay. You'll notice as I get into my HB and H2, they're very light. They're also a very hard graphite point. This means if you're not careful, it'll be really easy to scratch or leave indentions in your paper as you're shading. So make sure you use a light touch. It's always easier to build up than it is to take off, although we can do that too, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now that I've got most of the blocks completed, I'm going to use a blending stump or tortillon to soften each step. The further down I get, the more graphite builds up on the tortillon, and I can even use that graphite that's left smeared on there to create a light shade for my final square. Another tool that's really helpful when using graphite is a sandpaper pad. This is how we clean that blending stump and get it back to white without ruining the rolled up paper. When you lose too much grit or it's just too dirty, you can pull off a strip and there's another piece of clean sandpaper underneath. A handheld sharpener is also really helpful. This way you can watch how your pencil is being sharpened and not chew it up and ruin it. I like to use vinyl white erasers. Pink erasers always leave smudges and are really disappointing. And this is a fun eraser. It's called a gum eraser that is really pliable, which means you can form it to create different shapes to erase or lift out graphite and charcoal in pieces. When it gets dirty, you just smush it around until all the graphite's gone and it's nice and clean. To clean off your tortillon, use the sandpaper pad and just swipe back and forth, rotating slightly every now and then to keep a nice sharp point. This helps you to be able to get in those corners while keeping a clean tortillon. Now let's apply the value scale in a gradient fashion. Again, I'm starting with a 9B pencil near the top, but you'll notice as I'm ready to start transitioning, I lift the pencil to show more paper underneath. As I skip down to a 4B pencil, I'm going back and coloring over where I had already used the 9B pencil. This is going to give me a smooth and even transition that's seamless. Here's a fun trick. If you need a darker dark than the 9B will allow, if you take a HB pencil and color hard over the top of it, burnishing that first layer of graphite into the paper, it seals it and allows you to go in with your 9B pencil and create a really dark black with your graphite. A fun trick that you can use is taking a piece of scratch paper and putting it between your hand and the paper that you're working on. This prevents your hand from smudging those graphite layers that you've put down and not making a mess on your picture. The oil in your hands also creates a nasty sludge that's hard to erase, as well as making it look messy and less skilled and having poor craftsmanship. As we continue down the scale, change your pencils often to create a nice layered transition. As we get close to the bottom, I'm going to take my blending stump or tortillon and blend from top to bottom, giving me a nice, smooth, even grading. Before we apply these skills to actual forms, let's review some of the tips we've talked about in this video. A blending stump or tortillon is a tightly rolled or twisted piece of paper that's used to blend soft mediums, especially graphite. Remember, don't use your fingers. It works, but it's going to leave oil from your skin and will be a difficult thing to erase later on if you need to. Don't forget to use scratch paper to create a barrier between your hand and the graphite, which means no smearing and no sludge. The center of your pencil is made up of graphite and clay. The more clay you have, the harder your center is and the lighter your pigment will be, but it will also be sharper. The more graphite you have in your pencil, the softer it will be, creating a darker value. To know which pencil you're dealing with, you need to look at the end of the pencil to find the number and letter that is written on the end. 9B is going to be your softest and most graphite. H9 is going to be your hardest and have the most clay content. And then right there in the middle is HB, which is commonly known as a number 2 pencil. Now let's dive back into application. To begin, you have to decide where your light source is going to be. Mine's going to be coming straight in from the front right here, making the tops of each of these forms the lightest portion of the shape. Now let's take that shape and make it a form. To do this, I'm going to take a number 4 pencil and start adding deeper values to the edges of the cylinder. A cylinder is round, and so as I start pulling in, it's going to taper in a circular motion. The square or cube and circle or sphere that are overlapping the cylinder will create a shadow that drops back and helps to establish the form. Hierarchy and overlapping help create depth in the image as well as the value does. Another helpful idea when trying to create form is to remember to use motions that help the eye achieve the direction that you're wanting the shape to go. By doing this, it helps to create a more cylindrical and round idea for our eye to read. I'm going to take an eraser and clean up the outside edges, as well as my kneaded eraser to pull a little bit of accentuated highlight throughout the middle of my cylinder. A cast shadow helps anchor all the shapes to the ground so they don't appear to be floating. To create contrast and variety, I'm going to make my sphere darker than the cylinder. I'm starting with the 9B and 6B pencils to create a layered look that is deeper and more exaggerated than the sphere. Again, I'm creating strokes with my pencil that follow the idea of a round shape. This convinces your viewer and their eye that it's no longer flat, but actually a round sphere. As I transition to different values and grades of pencils, I'm continuing that rounding motion, getting ever smaller as I get closer to the top where the highlight should be. As I get closer to that highlight, I'm also switching pencils using a harder graphite, meaning a lighter shade. Once I'm comfortable with the amount of graphite I've laid down, I'm going to again take my blending stump and soften and round out that sphere completely. Once I'm happy with the transition, I'll take my eraser and intensify my highlight. Again, I'll add a cast shadow under the sphere, anchoring the sphere to the ground. Sharpener to give me a nice clean point. Taking my scratch paper, I'm going to put it under my hand to make sure there's no graphite smudging. And this time I'm actually going to start with my highlight on the top of my cube using the residual graphite that is on my blending stump. Follow it up by, again, my 9B pencil in the very tip corner, because this is going to be the furthest point from the light for this cube. The big difference in the form of the cube as opposed to the sphere and the cylinder is the panels or planes of the cube are flat, not round. So I'm going to be doing up and down motions that help lead the eye to believe that it's flat and getting closer to the light the higher we get on each side. Using the blending stump, I'm going to soften that edge and make a nice, even, solid transition the way we have with everything so far, and use an eraser to really clean up that edge so it's nice and crisp. The final plane of the cube is going to be slightly lighter than the left side, but darker than the top, so each panel is obviously separate. This really punches through the idea of form. One last cast shadow is going to really drive this form home, anchoring everything to the ground and giving us a nice pop of contrast. And now it's your turn. Give it a try before we apply these ideas to a realistic image.